Hi, my name is Abby Morrow, and I'm the Community Engagement Librarian at the Ellsworth Public Library. And we're so happy to have folks from Schoodic Institute and the park here to talk about the future of Maine's trees. So I'm going to kick it over to Catherine. If each of you could just perhaps introduce yourselves, and then we'll go right into the presentation. As I just said, we will be doing a Q&A, but we'll be doing it in the chat. So as we go along, feel free to put your questions in the chat, and we'll keep an eye on that. And I just also wanted to say briefly that this program was made possible by the National Endowment for the Arts, as well as Arts Midwest. So we really appreciate their support. And there are more programs coming soon. So please check out our big read on the Ellsworth Public Library's website. And with that, I will turn it over to Catherine.
Hi, everybody. I'm Catherine Schmitt. I'm the Science Communications Specialist at Schoodic Institute. And I'm going to share this presentation with President and CEO Nick Fisichelli. But I'm going to start. And I'm going to start with a story from Acadia National Park. Because what's interesting, and you might be wondering, why are we talking about the future of Maine's trees? And we know a lot about the past, the present, and the future of trees from studies that have been done in Acadia National Park. So I'm going to share a story from a pond in Acadia National Park, and Nick's going to help me change the slides if you want to. This is, does anybody know what body of water this is in Acadia? You can enter your answers in the chat. And this is a very special pond. It's believed to be the first lake in Maine, and that's because Acadia's location on the coast, but also with some high elevation terrain, means that it was some of the first land exposed after the glacier melted away, beginning about 22,000 years ago. And researchers from the University of Maine, a little over 10 years ago, studied this pond because as the landscape emerged from the ice, sediment came in, dust came in, and plants came in, and you can study the evolution of that landscape and those plants by looking at the mud at the bottom of the pond. Just looking at the chat. Yes, Maureen is correct. It is Sargent Mountain Pond, and this sits between the peaks of Sargent and Penobscot Mountains in Acadia National Park. You can change the slide, Nick. And so from taking a core from the mud at the bottom of the pond, we can see the evolution of the landscape. So this map that you're seeing on the left of your screen is showing where the ice was. And so the ice had been way further south. The limit of the Laurentide ice sheet was about around Long Island and Cape Cod, and by 16,000 years ago it had reached present day coast of Maine. And so there's the ocean and a little bit of poplar moving in and tundra moving in the wake of the melting ice. And at that time, these high elevation areas would have been what are called nunataks. And so it's just the very tip top of the mountain that would be emerging from the ice as bare rock. And so this imaginary image of maybe what it would have looked like 16,000 years ago on the summit of Katahdin, and as well as on the summit of Sargent and Cadillac Mountains in Acadia National Park. They would have been poking up above the ice, and everything would have been bare rock. Next. You can change the slide, Nick. We go, after about another 500 years, the ice continues to melt away, and actually because the ice was in contact with the ocean, we have the ocean is sort of flooding inland and chasing the ice north. And here is Sargent Mountain Pond, and it's been sitting there for a few hundred years, and we start to see some shrubby willows and birches and other flowering plants developing around the pond. And then their pollen is drifting in and settling to the bottom of the mud, and that's how we know they were there. And it might have looked something like this image from Bering Land Bridge from the National Park Service. You can change the slide. Another 1,500 years go by and we start to see some forest moving in. So there would have been a mixed woodland of hemlock and white pine and northern hardwoods as the landscape is warming. And so all of this is to show that the forests have changed as the climate has changed in the past, and what that shifts in tree species would have looked like. And if we go forward in time just a little bit more, 12,300 years ago, there would have been a mature forest of spruce and jack pine. We zoom out a little bit and look at the northeastern United States, we can see the movement of other tree species from areas that are called refugia, so where they were living when most of the landscape was covered in ice, and how they moved north into Maine as climate shifted over thousands of years. So this is just an example of 3 different tree species and around. So for example, 5,000 years ago was actually a warm and dry period in the landscape that became Maine, and we saw a lot of hemlock. And it was about the forest as we know it today came to be around 500 years ago. So what we think of as Maine forests in Acadia on the coast of Maine throughout the state are really have been looked somewhat similar for just a few 100 years. And on the coast, we saw spruce fir persisting because the Gulf of Maine has a cooling influence. So it keeps, winters are a little bit milder, but summers are a little bit cooler. And so spruce really shifted to northern Maine, but was able to hang on the coast because of that influence of the ocean. And that's still the case today, where there's a narrow fringe of spruce and fir along the coast and on the islands of Maine. And so here's the forest around Sargent Mountain Pond as it looks today between Sargent and Penobscot Mountains. So trees respond to climate change. They're going to grow where they prefer, you know, where the temperature and the precipitation and the soil is right for their particular requirements. And thinking about that and knowing that they shift in response to climate, we can think a little bit about how the climate is continuing to change and how that change is accelerating. And in the last 125 years, climate in Maine has changed very rapidly. The average temperature is 3.2 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than it was in 1895. The Gulf of Maine is almost 3 degrees warmer than it was 125 years ago. Temperature zones in the mountains have shifted upslope. We get about 6 more inches of rain a year. All of these figures are from the Maine's Climate Future 2020 update, which came out in February and is available on Schoodic Institute's website and the Maine Climate Change Institute at the University of Maine. We also know that things aren't changing the same everywhere or during the same seasons. So winter is the fastest changing season. And the coast is actually warming more than northern Maine. We're seeing, so the winter temperatures, the low temperatures in the winter have been warming faster and more than other temperatures. And so we're seeing fewer days with ice cover, fewer days of frost, fewer days of snow, not as, you know, almost 2 weeks less that we can do snowmaking at the ski resorts. And that all means that we're getting more thaw, more bare ground, more mud. And important for Maine's trees is that those low temperatures in winter tend to be what prevents forest pests and invasive insects from coming into Maine. And so as the winter warms, they may survive over the winter where previously they had not. And that's a big concern for the forests. And then if we think about where we are in Acadia National Park on the coast, that part of Maine has warmed more than inland. So it matters where you are, and it matters what season that you're in. And we also know that these trends are accelerating. So not only are things warmer than they were, but that warming and more precipitation trend is just getting, it's all happening faster. And we can look at Acadia specifically and look at the trends over time. I think we have a little animation where we can see the average temperature over the long term, and then most recently, those years from 2000 to 2019 are shown with red And so annual temperature is increasing on the x-axis and precipitation is increasing on the y. And so that upper right corner is really the warmer and wetter, which is what we've seen in the last 2 decades. So we know that this is happening in Acadia. What does it mean? How, what's happening to the trees? What are the impacts of this climate change that we're already seeing on Maine's trees? And this is from what we know from researchers and scientists who are studying this very question. We know that trees are leafing out earlier in the spring. So as the spring comes earlier and warmer temperatures come earlier, we're seeing those leaves come out earlier. And then they're also changing later in the fall. So this year, I don't know, maybe some of you, it seemed like it happened a little early this year, and that's because in general, foliage peak has been shifting later, in Acadia specifically. So sort of there's earlier leaf out, or later die off, increasing drought stress. Warmer temperatures mean that trees are having to move, it's evaporating water more quickly from their leaves. Even during a normal precipitation year, the warmer temperatures can stress trees. We are seeing those spruce fir zones shifting up mountains in the Western Mountains and White Mountains of New England. There are signs that sugar maple are declining and birch is declining, and that beech may be increasing in Maine forests. Nick's going to talk a little more about specific tree species, and certainly increased pests and disease are also a problem. So that's a little snapshot of sort of where Maine's trees have been and where we're at right now, and I'm going to turn it over to Nick Fisichelli to bring us into the future.
Great, thank you, Catherine. And hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us tonight. Again, I'm Nick Fisichelli. I'm the President and CEO with Schoodic Institute at Acadia National Park, and I'm also a forest ecologist. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the science for understanding our forests, both today and then the challenges they face and for adapting to changing conditions. So we'll start here with forests of the world. We'll start at a global view, and then we'll zoom in to Maine and our neighborhood, so to speak. So certainly living in Maine, we almost take it for granted that forests are ubiquitous, but that's not necessarily true across the globe. Here in green, you see forest cover across on land, and it's about roughly a third, or really about 30% of the land area of the globe is covered in forest. We're quite lucky in Maine that about 90% of the state is covered in forest, and it's actually the highest percent cover of any state in the U.S. And just looking here globally at forest, there are really 3 distinct biomes of forest, or really broad forest types. So, and these are tropical, temperate, and boreal forest. And so the tropical forests are in the equatorial areas of the world. So in South America, in Africa, and then in Oceania. So in Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, those areas in the South Pacific. And those are your tropical forest biome. Then the temperate forest is the forest we think of to the south of us, places like the mid-Atlantic U.S. and the southeastern U.S. And then most of Europe, Central Europe, is in the temperate forest zone, as well as China and Japan. And so those areas of Southeast Asia. And those are the forests we think of with broadleaf trees like oaks and maples and hickories and ash trees, and some pines as well as some of the common temperate tree species. And then to the north, we have the boreal forest. This is the forest from Alaska through Canada, and then Northern Europe and Scandinavia and through Siberia. And this is that boreal forest of spruce and jack pine and Scots pine, these really cold adapted species. And so there's 3 forest types across the U.S. And where we live here in Maine, we're really at a transition between 2 of these forest types. So the cold boreal forest to the north, which is in the dark green in this slide, and then the temperate forest to the south, which is in the very light green. So most of Maine is in this medium green, which is that transition zone. So this is where the cold adapted boreal species like spruce and fir, their ranges overlap with those warm adapted species like maple and oak. And so this is an area that's really thought to likely be very sensitive to climate because you have so many tree species at or near their range limits. And so this is where some of the science comes in, thinking about the future forest and how is it going to look and how are conditions going to change. And so there's lots of tools that scientists use. Some of this is computer modeling, species distribution modeling, climate envelope modeling are some of the terms for it. Sounds fancy. It's really just answering three super simple questions here. Basically, where are tree species found on the landscape today? What are the current conditions in those areas, most specifically the climate and other local factors like the soil type? And then where will those conditions be in the future? So thinking, for example, about warming temperatures, where are those potential suitable habitat areas in the future? And so for the modeling work that's done, basically it's just answering these three questions, and we can look at just a little bit of the results from these types of models. And so here's a forest type map for the northeastern US. This is current forest type. You see a few different major colors here. That sort of a dark pink color is the maple beech birch forest. The turquoise blue is the spruce fir that we see up here in Maine. And then there's a little bit of green in here in Pennsylvania. That's the oak hickory forest. And so these are the major forest types found on the landscape today. And so the modeling work looks at where those forest types are found today and then takes into account warming temperatures to do some projections for the future on how the future forest, on future habitat suitability in the future. And so you see two projections for the future. A low emissions scenario is the middle figure, and then the one to the right is a high emissions scenario. And what you see in the low emissions climate future, so it's some warming, a moderate amount of warming, we see really the spruce fir, which was that turquoise color, really shifting north out of Maine into Canada. And we see in the expansion of that maple birch beech forest. And it's the suitable habitat for those forest types. And then under the high emission scenario, we see a whole lot of green there, which is that oak hickory forest, which we think of really down in the mid-Atlantic region. And so this is showing that the conditions suitable for these forest types in the future based on warming temperatures. So it's not projecting that these exact species will be in these places, but rather that the conditions will be suitable for these species. And so it's really an important caveat of these types of models. So they're really useful in telling us how much conditions are going to change and which species might be able to grow. It doesn't, though, tell us which species will grow on the landscape. And that's a lot of the research that we're doing, and that Kate Miller, who's also on, who's a forest ecologist with the National Park Service, a lot of her inventory and monitoring and research work focuses on this question, and others that we'll mention in this presentation as well. So can trees get here from there? Normally you can't get there from here, but in this case we're thinking about getting here from there. Can trees and their seeds shift? If we know that the potential suitable habitat is changing, are trees going to be able to shift across the landscape? And so this is where we certainly use computer models, but then also this is where we get to get our hands dirty as scientists, as ecologists. This is the kind of the research that certainly we like to do, where we get to actually test things on the ground. So here's a little bit of the research and work from Kate, and she'll be able to answer questions at the end of the the presentation as well. She's on tonight. So can trees get here from there? So in the past, Catherine showed how the vegetation shifted across the landscape at the end of the last ice age. And really that shift of vegetation, trees, it was a response to the warming change in climate. And migration was really responding to climate. And we think it will do the same again now and in the future, but there's lots of other factors that are also have changed since 20,000 years ago. And that's also part of this research, things such as habitat connectivity, habitat fragmentation, other questions about other global change stressors we'll talk a little bit about, such as overabundant deer, exotic species, and just interactions with seed dispersal and ability of species to establish and grow. So one of the big barriers to migration, to moving across the landscape, is an idea about habitat fragmentation and the urbanization of a lot of areas, especially thinking between Boston and Washington, D.C. You can think this is the most densely populated area of the U.S. And so here on this map, the warmer the color, the red colors are areas where there's been a lot of human modification to the landscape, either through urban areas and development and also through agriculture as well. And so some of Kate's research has found that these areas could really be barriers to the migration of tree species that may be shifting from areas further south and moving north. And of course, that movement of trees is via their seeds. So plants move by seed. And that's really an important component as well to think about and understand. How are seeds going to be able to move across the landscape, and how are they going to fare with, for example, seed predators? So species such as squirrels are really important both in dispersing seeds, but then also eating them as well. And this is some research that was done at Schoodic by Alessio Mortalliti, who's a professor at Maine in Orono, and looking to see how are seed predators such as mice and voles and red squirrels going to interact with these novel seeds of species that are moving into the region. And so he did a really neat experiment, basically putting out an all-you-can-eat buffet of different seeds and then seeing how the squirrels interacted with these seeds, including novel seeds such as oak and hickory seeds that they hadn't encountered before. And really results from this suggest that the seed predators are happy to eat these new seeds that they hadn't yet encountered, such as from these southern species, but they also disperse those seeds a little further across the landscape and cache them. And so they may actually be agents to help some of these trees migrate across the landscape as conditions continue to change. Other factors that are going to challenge the tree regeneration, the ability of these seeds to then establish and grow as seedlings and saplings and eventually into the overstory as trees. One of those is deer. And Kate does a lot of research in the Mid-Atlantic region, in some of the forests down there. And this is a photo from one of those parks, just showing the lack of any tree regeneration in the understory. So no little seedlings, you just see the leaf litter in the understory, and you can even see a browse line on all these small trees here that the deer they're sort of like the vacuum cleaners, and they suck up all the little seedlings on the forest floor and eat them. And so where deer are super overabundant due to changes in habitat and a lot more edge in agricultural areas surrounding forests, there can be really high deer densities, which affect which species are able to establish in the understory. And then in addition to deer, another issue can be non-native invasive plant species, which can actually crowd out the understory and the growing space and outcompete the native tree seedling. So this is another photo from Kate from a plot at one of the Mid-Atlantic parks. And And there are actually 4 people in this photo, but they're actually hard to see because they're in a sea of really thick non-native shrubs here that create this really formidable layer, this shrub layer that tree seedlings would not be able to grow through. And so they're also an important filter to take into account as we're trying to understand how the forest is going to change with changing conditions. And then some other research here closer to home. This is actually some of our work we're doing in Acadia, and where we're doing some common garden experiments. So this is a way to test the various tree species to see once they were to arrive here, are they going to be able to establish and grow and persist? And so we're growing the same tree species, 19 different tree species at 4 sites across Acadia, and seeing if they're able to establish and grow, survive over the winter. And we ran this experiment here for 3 seasons, and we grew individuals both as bare root saplings, but then also seeds. And one of the key findings from this is that moisture is really key. So we think a lot about warming temperatures, but moisture availability is also really important. Of course, this past summer was really a drought across the state of Maine, and that's really critical, especially for young seedlings that are just establishing, have nascent root systems. They're really sensitive to drought conditions. And you can see in the photos here, and the left is our coastal site, actually on the Schoodic Institute campus, which is a cool and wet site. And you see lots of green here, lots of seedlings from seed that established, 475 seedlings at that point. And then to the right here, we see the photo from a warm and dry site, actually on Mount Desert Island, a low elevation site in the interior part of the island. And it's really dry, and there were only 19 seedlings at that site in comparison. And so the moisture conditions are really important in this case in determining the ability of trees to establish and grow from seed. Beyond the tree testbed study in Acadia, we're doing some work across the region. One project we have called the Future Forests of Coastal Maine. This is an experiment. We're growing 8 different tree species at sites from Belfast to the Schoodic Peninsula, and these are on land trust and private lands. And working together with these landowners and managers who are really interested in thinking about the future forest and which species will do well. And so 2 springs ago, we planted these 8 different tree species at these 4 sites, and we're tracking their growth and survival over time, as well as their ability to survive browse pressure from deer at these sites. So these are all some examples of the research that we're doing, some of the science and tools that we're using to understand how forests are changing and how they may look in the future. And the goal of our research is really to inform then stewardship of our forests. And this is a quote from George Perkins Marsh. The improvement of forest trees is the work of centuries, so much more the reason for beginning now. He was around in the mid-1800s, really thought a lot about nature. He was a senator and a statesman. He wrote America's first book on conservation as well, and he grew a really nice beard also. So he really thought hard about ideas about stewardship, and we're ideas that certainly hold today. And he was around again in the mid 1800s, so prior to modern climate change. But his realization here that we need to be stewards and of our lands and our forests, and it is ongoing work. And today that work really is about climate change adaptation, and this is the idea about adjusting to changing conditions when I talk about climate change adaptation. And it's a focus on preparing for and managing climate change impacts. And with any change, there's both harm to mitigate, but there may also be opportunities to harness as well. And really the overarching theme for this is to manage for change, not just persistence. This idea that the forests and how they looked in the past may not necessarily be how they will look in the future. As Catherine mentioned, the forests we see out there today, it's really only been over the last 500 years or so that they've looked as they do now. And when you take that paleo perspective, when you look at the last 15,000 years, we see a really dynamic landscape. And important for us to recognize that nature is dynamic and is always changing, and that we need to work with nature in our stewardship. And that we definitely play a key role in stewarding our forests here in Maine. And so we really invite you to join us in paying attention to Maine's trees. And there's lots of ways to do this, to monitor your woods and your favorite trees, and to be aware of and prepared for the coming changes, and also to share your findings. Citizen science is one of the tools that we use at Schoodic Institute to engage people in the science and solutions. And there's lots of great platforms out there, a lot of apps that you can use, such as iNaturalist, Nature's Notebook, eBird, to report the observations that you're making out there. And then other actions that you can take, certainly some important ones, not to spread invasive species, plant species, and then also invasive insects and diseases, so not moving firewood is a really important action. You've probably heard about that with emerald ash borer. That's one of the ways that it's moved so rapidly across the landscape is through firewood. So really important not to move firewood. And then to protect and restore habitat. And then finally, a really important piece is mitigation, climate change mitigation. So making sure that we stay off of that high emissions trajectory, where it will be much more of a challenge to steward healthy forests in the future under such rapid changes. So that's the end of the presentation, and at this point we can pause and open it up for questions.
Thank you both so much. That was super informative and really enlightening about where we're going. I do see one question so far in the chat. I can read it, and then whoever would like to take it may do so. Barbara wonders, how will the acidity of Maine soil affect species migration?
Yeah, that's a great question, Barbara. Yeah, as I showed in those species distribution models, the climate envelope models, a lot of those models, they take into account the soil type. And certainly many areas of Maine, especially coastal Maine, where Acadia is, has relatively thin, poor, and acidic soils. And so that will affect which species will be able to grow well. Certainly nutrient demanding species are going to have a hard time in those areas. And so certainly climate is one important factor, but there are many others that determine where trees grow on the landscape, and soil nutrients is an important piece.
Great. Here's another question. Questions are rolling in now. From Jen, we have, what are some of the invasive plant species that are crowding out natives?
Kate, are you interested in answering that one?
That that's so, as Nick said, I lead forest monitoring for Acadia, but also 20 parks from Virginia to Maine. So I'm kind of like working in the future forests of Acadia currently in Virginia. And what we're finding, especially in the Northeast, that's crowding out native species are invasive shrubs. So Japanese barberry, exotic honeysuckle, bittersweet. It's really all the woody stuff that is really causing the problem for us. Japanese stiltgrass is another one further south that I think maybe some of you have heard that it just recently was found in southern Maine. That's definitely a concern, but at least for what we're finding in kind of like New England parks, it's really the invasive shrubs.
Great, thanks. And then the next one I see is from Kevin. How do the projections address probable disease and pest mortality?
Yeah, so often they don't. Some of the models, depending on the researcher, the data they're using, may explicitly take into account pests and diseases, but often they're not able to. And so these models, they have to simplify the conditions, and so they may not take that into account. And so, a good example right now is white pine. As many may have heard, white pine is dealing with a host of needle diseases right now. It's really a complex of needle diseases that it's dealing with that are causing it to drop its needles early. And it's a species really projected to do pretty well in Maine in the future as conditions change, but it's a species that's actually struggling more than would be expected from some of the modeling work. And I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you. The next one is from Laura, and she says, how does the idea of NPS as climate refugia, I believe, come into the future of trees in Acadia?
Yeah, thanks, Laura, for that question. Yeah, so climate refugia are the idea that there are places on the landscape that won't warm as rapidly as other areas, or that will retain suitable habitat for species in the future. And if we look at about 3,000 to 1,000 years ago, it was relatively warm in the Northeast, and it was actually a time where spruce at that point moved further north into Canada. Has really come back over the last 1,000 years, and so that's what's projected to happen again. But actually, spruce persisted along the coast of Maine, as well as higher elevations in the mountains, and so the coast was a climate refugium for spruce. And there's some thoughts that depending on the magnitude of climate change, the coast of Maine will again act as a refugium for some of these cold adapted species. But that's going to really depend ultimately on the magnitude of warming that we're going to see in the future. Kate, anything you want to add to that?
No, I think you covered it. I mean, it's also just kind of about like, what can we do in a place like Acadia where we're trying to protect species, and identifying possible refugia may be a way to help protect species, but it's not going to solve all of our problems because the matrix may, massively change and we may lose a lot of our spruce fir.
Okay, thank you guys. Tate would like to know, has anyone in Maine observed an occurrence of plant migration, a new species someplace?
That's a great question, Tate. And so the places to look for changes are often on edges or at those ecotones where you transition from one forest type to another, or places like tree line, the alpine tree line, up in the mountains. And I'm not sure about in Maine specifically. Certainly some places have seen changes at tree line, especially a filling in of more trees at higher elevations at tree line. And that has happened also at that ecotone between the spruce fir forest and the beech birch maple forest in the mountains as well. There's been some evidence of species moving across that ecotone as well. And so that evidence is in seedlings that are establishing beyond where the adult trees are. So there's a little bit of evidence of that. There's also, other evidence of trees or plants disappearing, not necessarily from climate change, but it could be from other things like land use. On Mount Desert Island, thanks to the extensive science that was done in inventory back in the late 1800s by the Champlain Society, which cataloged all the plant species found on Mount Desert Island, and then work that's been done over the last 20 years, we now know that actually 1 in 6 plant species that was found on Mount Desert Island in the late 1800s is no longer found on the island. And so it's a case of land use change that's really caused a big shift in which plants are found on the island. And it's one of those changes we would never know about except for the fact that there's this great data set from 140 years ago. So it's also another reason to pay attention, as I said, to observe our natural world and to make observations and share those observations so that we can sort of build on that science both now and in the future.
Thank you. Carol would like to know, are there any natural deer deterrents or deer resistant plants?
There's
Kate, you want to
certainly,
talk
yeah,
about that?
yeah, there certainly are deer-resistant plants, and they tend to be invasive plants, and then they take off. So, like the shrubs that I talked about earlier, they generally deer don't eat them. That's why they do so well. If you're looking for like things to plant in your garden, like sedges are actually pretty deer-resistant, and they make a nice kind of, instead of using I can't think of the word right now, but they just make a nice ground cover, I guess. So like Caryxes is the genus. And I think a lot of nurseries now will kind of say like deer resistant because a lot of people are concerned about that these days. Just make sure it's not invasive.
Nice. From Barbara, it's hard to imagine this area without our ubiquitous spruces and pointed firs. What can we expect to observe as the climate changes, and how soon might we see these species begin to die out?
Thanks, Barbara, on that question. And that's, there's the Danish proverb that prediction is difficult, especially about the future. And this is true, so true here with climate and how species are going to respond to it. The answer is we don't know, is the short answer to that. Likely it's not going to be gradual, though. It'll be sort of it'll happen episodically with other events like a drought, or it could be a tree pest or disease that interacts with the warming temperatures that could cause a more rapid shift. But when something like that's going to happen, it's really hard to say. And also, some species are going to be more resilient to changes than we might recognize, whereas other species are going to be more sensitive. I mentioned how white pine is dealing with a complex of needle diseases right now. Red spruce, which is the ubiquitous tree of Maine, it's the most abundant tree in the state. We are the white pine state, but really we should be the red spruce state. And it's the most abundant tree here on the coast and into down east Maine. It's projected to struggle. So for the down east region, some of those projections I shared, it's projected to lose about half of its suitable habitat, which also means it's going to potentially maintain half of its suitable habitat. Laura asked the question about the about the climate refugia. So there may be areas where it does persist on the landscape. And it's also a species right now that's doing really well. It's been relatively wet over the last few decades. And thanks to the Clean Air Act in the early 90s, there's a lot less sulfur and nitrogen deposition in rain. So there's a lot less acid rain. And so it's a tree that's doing well right now, even though it's projected to do poorly in the future. So we could be surprised by some species as far as how they respond to change. And that's one of the reasons why we're doing the on-the-ground science experiments, getting our hands dirty, is to really test out how these species are responding so we can better understand which species will do well in the future.
Great.
Yeah, and sorry, I was just going to say
Of course.
what we're finding in the monitoring we're doing in Acadia, at least, is like spruce is it is increasing at all levels from seedlings up to large trees. It's increasing in its dominance right now. So that's a good thing, but we don't know when that's going to start to change.
Okay, great. So I do have another question from Teresa. She says, will the ash borer destroy so many trees in the northern Maine woods and cause drastic forest fires?
Yes, that's the emerald ash borer, I believe is what Teresa means. And so that is, it's a non-native invasive tree pest, which I think many people have heard about. It's caused, the mortality of millions of ash trees, especially in the Midwest. So Ohio, Michigan is really the epicenter of where it was first introduced accidentally and established. It's found right now in a couple places in Maine. Ash is not a super abundant tree species. It's typically an uncommon tree in the forest. It's found in lots of areas, but you don't often find big stands of ash. And so, at least not here in coastal Maine where we are. And even up north, there may be some black ash swamps, but it's not a super abundant tree. But in those places where it is found, there is the potential, for major die-off of that tree, as has happened in other places. There's a lot of active research happening right now on control measures for the ash borer, including some biological controls, so some species that other insects that prey upon emerald ash borer, but there isn't at this point a really effective treatment against ash borer, other than just stopping the spread of, for example, firewood, which is one of the key ways that it moves across the landscape.
Nice. I'll keep an eye on the chat here. I did have a quick question. Okay, I think I can ask it really quick, and then we have one more from Debbie. I was just wondering if one of you might be able to speak briefly about any sort of citizen science initiatives that you are maybe currently offering or might offer in the future, in case anyone has been inspired by this conversation or by reading Lab Girl to kind of get their hands dirty and get involved in that way. Is maybe if there's a link, if I know Catherine's been sharing some, so if you've already shared that, my apologies, but I just thought it might be a good way to connect folks with these organizations if they're interested in getting involved in on a more long-term level.
Yeah, and in the chat, Catherine's been sharing some information and some links to stories we have on our website, and stories that Catherine has written about some of the research and work we have ongoing. So I would check that out. And sometimes there are various projects that come up. We just had one on sea stars. So shifting from forests to the intertidal zone and sea stars, and there was a citizen science project to share your observations of sea stars. There was a large population of sea stars being observed between the Blue Hill Peninsula and the Schoodic Peninsula. So just another example of a project in some of our citizen science work. Catherine, you want to add anything to that?
I just want to add that we have a very timely citizen science project right now for people who are local to Acadia looking at changes in fall foliage. So earlier I talked about how we have documented some shifts that the foliage, the changing leaf color seems to be happening later, but we need more photos to help confirm that preliminary finding. And so that researcher, I'll post the link in the chat, but she's actually looking not just for photos of sort of the Acadia Mount Desert Island landscape as the foliage is changing today, but also if any of you went to Acadia in the past, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 50 years ago, she's looking for historic photos so she can match them up with some of the aerial photography and other data that isn't as high resolution as it is right now. And so anything that's before 2000 that wouldn't be filtered, a scanned photo or an old slide you might have scanned, that's especially valuable. And so that's a great way to participate. And I'll share that link right now.
Oh, that's wonderful. I'll just very briefly say I have not publicized this yet on our website, but we're actually doing a contest this month for the Big Read, which is take a photo of your favorite tree. So maybe I can try to get that information if you share the link out on our website as well, so we can encourage people to do that for sure. The comment from Debbie was asking me to read aloud the answer that Catherine gave. It looks like, I'm just going to paraphrase this in interest of time, that you have something going on tomorrow regarding the Maine's Climate Institute. Maine's Climate Future report.
Yeah, the question was about the Maine Climate Council. And so we were involved in the UMaine effort, the Maine's Climate Future 2020 report, which is really the update on the latest science. But we're closely following the Maine Climate Council, and Ivan Fernandez, who's a member of the council and co-chairs the scientific and technical subcommittee of the council, will be doing a talk at noon tomorrow with Schoodic Institute. So that's the link I shared.
Okay, and folks can register at that link if they choose to?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, great. And I think we have time for one more question, and we have one here from Emma. If someone else can read it, I just know I'm going to butcher the pronunciation. Can you guys all see the chat?
Yeah, I can read it. Maybe Kate can chime in on that. So it's a question about using glyphosate, which is an herbicide, a chemical herbicide, as a control for favoring the fastest growing tree species. And the question is about the impacts of widespread use of this herbicide.
Yeah, you know, I don't know that much about the reporting. Isn't it meant to actually suppress the fast growing, like the hardwoods, so that you get conifers back? I think that's generally why glyphosate's used, but I know it's used for invasive species management, and it's usually kind of, you know, small areas, small amounts for good cause. I don't really know the long-term impacts, like environmental impacts, besides what it's doing to the trees. I don't know that much on like the physiological impacts of glyphosate. It seems like there's a lot of information out there, and it's hard to know what's correct and what's not.
Yeah, I'm in the same boat on that one.
Okay, well, thank you all so much. We are rounding out to 8 o'clock. I just want to briefly mention, for anyone who joined us a little bit after we started, we are recording this session, and I will make that available on the library's website and on our Facebook page. Hopefully by tomorrow. I will make that a priority to get that up there. You can always email me as well if you are having trouble with Facebook, or you just would rather not go about it that way. And I'm putting my email into the chat real quick. Thank you very much to Catherine, Nick, and Kate. We learned so much tonight, and we really appreciate your time. And wonderful. I think that's all I have to say for right now. And if any of you, other of you, want to say anything in closing, that's completely fine. But
Thanks for having us. Thanks everybody for joining us. Great questions.
Sure. Oh, thank you.
Yeah, thanks everybody.